My name is Katie, and my group was responsible for chapters 9 and 10 in The Phantoms in the Brain by Dr. Ramachandran. Chapter 9 is God and the Limbic System, and it discusses some of the things that can go wrong with perception, which led me to be curious about how memories are formed, and specifically how the brain wires for significance. So we are constantly bombarded by sensory stimulus, so much so that most of it doesn't ever make it into our conscious thought. The sensory stimulus is input to which all of our actions are based in response to. Memory allows us to figure out what to do in response to stimulus. But what is memory, and how does it help us sort out what is important to pay attention to? Memories of past experiences are formed in the neocortex. We have talked about different functional areas of the brain, about the functionality of individual neurons, columns, and microcolumns. But with memory, we are making long network connections between lots of different areas. For example, I am a chemistry major. When I think about chemistry lab, I am pulling on information coded in many different regions. There's a lot of activation in the temporal lobe what pathway, identifying glassware, different instruments. There's the parietal lobe sensory memory of the itchy lab coats that they make us wear, the humidity of the splash-proof goggles, which inevitably fog up. There's also activation in the medial prefrontal cortex, associated with the olfactory stimulation that is incredibly prevalent in chemistry experiments. So I have this network of memory that is associated with chemistry lab, which extends to many parts of my brain. On the neuron level, memory networks are comprised of synaptic connections. Strong connections form between neurons with increased dendritic spines. There were some memory tests done on newborn chicks. And these chicks, baby chicks, were given a learning exercise of being presented with two different kinds of glass beads. One of the glass beads, they're different colors. One color tasted really foul to them, the other one was fine. And it took a very short period of time for the chicks to be able to discriminate between the two, and they would no longer peck at the foul tasting ones. So at the point that they had learned this behavior, there was no notable change in dendrite length or diameter. However, there was, for those that had learned the new behavior, there were increases in spine head diameter and a shortening of spine stem length. The more ingrained the memory, the more stable and large the dendritic spines were. Memories are formed by adding or selective removal of synaptic connections that represent discrete aspects of the environment or within our own bodies. This can happen in two ways, either bottom up or top down. So for bottom up, we start with sensory stimulation, which then is processed, and then association areas are built, which turn into memories. From top down, it begins with the attention network, which then gets reference to previous information that we have, forming new associations on top of or adjacent to old information. So for example of bottom-up learning, when we are learning how to read, we see a word or we see a combination of letters, cat for example, and cat is just bars of light activating different neurons in different areas on the page and in different orientations. That's the base sensory stimulation that we get. Sensory processing then pulls those bars of light together to make up the different letters. Association areas are built at the point that the word cat, the three letters cat, are pulled together. So we make an association area for C and we make an association area for cat. At the point that it is a firmly lodged memory, we're able to sight read and we see the word cat and we know it's cat without having to think about it. For top down, an example would be paying attention in class, learning a new thing about synapses, which you're referencing to old information about synapses, and hopefully you're walking away with a deeper understanding of what you already knew. So I was just talking about the attention network, which is part of the, or used as part of the limbic system. I am going to be telling you more about specifically the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala is essential for evaluating emotional significance of perception. And damage to the amygdala can lead to an emotional disconnect to memories and perception. And we saw this in Capgras syndrome. Disruptions of the amygdala meant that there was not the emotional significance to seeing people that were known, seeing parents, for example. And so there was this very disorienting disconnect between the memory and the perception of the memory. The role of the hippocampus we saw in all of the studies that were done on HM, who historically, or who had his hippocampus removed on both sides of the brain. He was unable to form any new memories. He could recall things from previous to the operation, but was not able to create new memories. So the hippocampus is responsible for making a map in the brain, a new network in the brain for memory. But the amygdala is really what strengthens that map. The amygdala is also responsible for what's called declarative or episodic memory, which really just means anything that would be the recalling of an event. It's not necessarily this is what cold feels like. That wouldn't be an episodic memory. But what you did on the snow day would be a episodic memory. So the consolidation of memory is really the job of the amygdala. And this occurs during emotionally arousing events, which cause heightened levels of cortisol and epinephrine to be released in the brain. And the amygdala is sort of the central hub for modulating the effects of these neurotransmitters on the creation and strengthening of new memory networks that were formed by the hippocampus. So this has been shown in studies with rats that are being taught new activities or behaviors, that if a rat is shown something once and is given an injection of epinephrine right afterwards, that memory is more likely to be lasting and the behavior to be seen in the future than a rat that did not have the injection of epinephrine, which we can sort of make sense of when we think about historically, evolutionarily, the fear-based responses or things that create fear in us are things that we should remember the most. If we see a saber-toothed tiger in a particular place and that's scary and we run away, we should probably avoid that place in the future because the saber-toothed tiger might eat us next time. So one of the ways that they test for the emotional relevance of memory is through the galvanic skin response. And the way that this works is that sensors are put on the fingers, and when there is an emotional response, the skin produces sweat, and this may not be sweat that you are consciously aware of producing. A sort of heightened experience of this would be getting clammy hands because you're really nervous. But anytime you're having an emotional response to some stimulus, there's an increase of liquid on your hands. And this is picked up by a very sensitive meter and can be seen in an increase of current being released through that liquid. So people that have had damage to the amygdala will not respond to emotionally to charged stimulus. So they'll see a picture of their parents or their loved ones, and there will be no emotional response. For someone that's had hippocampal damage, There will be emotional response, but they won't be able to explain to you why they're responding the way that they are. So some of my group mates will be covering a specific scenario of what can go wrong in the brain's connections, specifically the heightened importance of religious symbology and the numbing of all other stimulus. As students, knowing how memory works helps us study smarter, connecting emotionally to the material and interconnecting ideas increases the likelihood we will remember what we need to in order for a test. Memory and perception is how we define ourselves, both because it shapes our future choices and is what our self-image is built off of. Understanding memory and how we code for significance is to understand the human experience.